The rain fell in heavy sheets, hammering against the ground with a relentless rhythm that drowned out every other sound. The once pristine lawns of the Whitmore estate, usually trimmed to perfection and admired by guests, had been transformed into slick, muddy patches that clung to the earth and swallowed each step with a sucking weight. The air carried the raw scent of wet soil and drenched leaves, a reminder that nature cared little for the grandeur of man's design. Standing tall at the heart of the storm was the mansion itself, a structure of elegance and dominance, its cream-colored walls gleaming faintly despite the darkened sky. Rain streaked down the tall windows, where faint light glowed from within, blurred and softened as though the house itself watched from behind a veil of tears. Each flash of lightning etched its silhouette against the heavens, turning it for a heartbeat into something both magnificent and foreboding. It was a symbol of wealth, of privilege, of a life so removed from hardship that most could only imagine what it must be like to reside within its walls, sheltered from the world's cruelties. Yet, just beyond that grandeur, beneath the shadow of a massive oak tree that had weathered countless seasons, an image of desolation unfolded, one that clashed with everything the estate represented. The storm that polished the mansion's walls now stripped the dignity from two forgotten lives. The tree's gnarled branches reached outward, a crooked umbrella offering little defense against the downpour, and beneath it sat the figures of an elderly couple, their presence more haunting than the storm itself. Huddled together in the pouring rain, their frail bodies slumped against each other as though clinging to the last bit of strength they had left. Their clothes were soaked through, heavy with water, plastered to their tired frames, their shapes diminished by the merciless weight. Strands of wet hair clung to their weathered faces, and their eyes, closed in weariness, spoke of exhaustion so profound that even the storm seemed powerless to rouse them. The lines etched deep into their skin told stories of decades lived, of sacrifices endured, and of hope that had perhaps once been bright but now flickered faintly in the storm's shadow. They had nothing left in the world but one another, and even that fragile connection seemed threatened by the unyielding downpour. The man leaned against the rough bark of the oak, as if it alone were holding him upright, while the woman rested her head upon his shoulder, her lips parted slightly as though she no longer had the strength to speak. At their side lay an old suitcase, the fabric torn and the lock broken, its contents spilling helplessly into the mud. Faded photographs, yellowed at the edges, told of a younger time, when smiles had been wide and the future still seemed vast. Tattered letters, their ink running in rivulets down the paper, whispered fragments of love and family that the storm now tried to erase. Each item was more than an object, they were fragments of lives reduced to memories, relics of a history now dissolving into the earth. It was in this moment that Alexander Whitmore, the man who owned the estate, appeared. Stepping out of his sleek black sedan, his polished shoes splashed in the puddled driveway as the storm lashed against his expensive coat. The low rumble of thunder seemed to pause around him as though the night itself was waiting to see what he would do. His movements halted almost instantly, his gaze drawn and held by the sight before him. For a moment he was frozen, his heart jolting in shock as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. This was not the kind of scene one expected to encounter outside a home of grandeur and comfort. The juxtaposition was jarring, his mansion glowing with warmth and safety, a fortress of abundance standing firm against the elements, while only a few yards away, two lives sat crumbling in the cold rain. The world, with all its inequalities, had suddenly collapsed into a single frame before his eyes, and Alexander found himself unable to look away. The man, his face etched with the marks of hardship and streaked with dirt, leaned heavily against the oak tree, as though the ancient trunk were the only force still strong enough to hold him upright. His breaths came shallow and labored, each inhale rattling through his frail chest as though the air itself weighed too much to bear. The years of struggle had carved valleys into his skin, lines that spoke of burdens long carried and hopes long deferred. He seemed less like a man and more like a monument to survival, weathered but not yet broken. The woman beside him was no less worn. Her dress clung tightly to her frail body, drenched until it became more a second skin than a garment, offering no protection from the merciless rain. She rested her head against the man's shoulder, the gesture small but profound, both tender and devastating in its quiet desperation. Her lips were parted slightly, as though words hovered there but refused to come forth, as though even speech had become too great a burden for her weary frame. In the faint light of the storm, her face carried the ghost of beauty that once must have shone brightly, now softened and dimmed by years of hardship. Together, they were a picture of fragility, two lives battered by time, circumstance, and neglect, set against the unyielding backdrop of staggering wealth. And for Alexander Whitmore, a man who had spent his life shielded by the fortress of luxury, it was the first time he had been forced to face such an unfiltered, unembellished image of human suffering. Their hands remained tightly intertwined, a fragile yet unyielding bond that the storm could not break. Fingers curled together, trembling and pale, they clung as though that single touch were the last thread binding them to the world. Around them the storm raged with an almost violent persistence. Sheets of rain hammering the ground and the trees bending under the weight of the wind. Yet for Alexander, the roar of the downpour seemed to fade, the chaos dimming until all that remained was the pounding of his own heart and the rush of thoughts flooding his mind. He stood rooted in place, his polished exterior cracking beneath the weight of the moment. Who were they? Why had they come here, of all places, here, to his estate, his carefully guarded world of privilege and control? His eyes searched them as though the answer might be carved into their faces, but the only truth he found was the raw, undeniable reality of their suffering. His gaze fell again to the old suitcase lying abandoned in the mud, the battered fabric darkened by the rain, the lock bent and broken. Its contents spilled outward like whispers of another life, fragments of memory unwilling to remain hidden. A black and white photograph caught his attention, half submerged in the wet grass. Two young faces smiled back at him from another era, unmistakably the same couple now slumped before him. Their eyes, once brimming with the radiance of youth, glowed with a hope so bright it seemed almost foreign in contrast to the hollow exhaustion of the present. Beside the photograph, a stack of worn letters sagged in the rain, the edges curled and softened by time. Ink bled down the paper in streaks, words dissolving into illegibility, but Alexander imagined the voices that once filled those pages, love notes exchanged in the early years, promises made and remembered, messages sent to children who had perhaps grown distant, or to family that had long since slipped away. Nearby lay a threadbare blanket, the fabric frayed and patched so many times that it was more memory than cloth. Now, drenched and heavy, it sagged uselessly against the mud, the faintest suggestion of a shield that had failed against the relentless cold. These were not simply possessions. They were remnants of lives once full, tokens of love. Of history, of dreams no different from anyone else's. And yet here they were, washed bare by the storm, reduced to little more than shivering silhouettes at the gates of wealth. And Alexander stood watching, the warmth of his mansion behind him, the glow of its windows casting light into the storm, while only yards away two lives unraveled in the mud. It was a tableau he could not look away from, a truth he could not ignore. The sight struck Alexander with a force he had not anticipated, rattling against the armor he had spent years perfecting. He had always thought of himself as self-made, a man who clawed his way to the top with relentless will, sharp instincts, and a refusal to let anyone or anything slow his momentum. Every deal he made, every sacrifice of time and energy, had forged the empire he now stood upon. And yet, with that climb had come a hardness, a deliberate narrowing of vision, a blind spot that allowed him to ignore suffering when it didn't press directly against his own life. He had taught himself to keep moving, to look past the struggles of others because acknowledging them would only slow him down. But now there was no looking away. Suffering was no longer a distant concept contained in headlines or television reports, no longer tucked away in corners of the city he rarely ventured into. It was here, on his front lawn, beneath the shadow of his mansion, so close he could see the raindrops trembling against their clasped hands. The sight cut deeper than any words could, dismantling the walls he had so carefully constructed around his conscience. Something stirred deep within him, unearthing memories he had worked hard to bury. He remembered hunger, the gnawing emptiness that once hollowed out his stomach, the sharp ache of cold nights when he wondered if he would ever know more than scraps of bread and whispered promises of someday. He remembered the way despair pressed down like a suffocating weight when he was young. The way each day felt like a test of endurance, survival always just out of reach. But success had dulled those memories, smothered them beneath years of wealth, comfort, and control. Until now. Confronted with this fragile pair, soaked and broken before him, the past surged back, raw and undeniable, pulling at a part of him he had long since silenced. He remembered his mother, her tired hands moving with quiet determination, working endless nights at jobs that drained her body yet never seemed to fill their table. He remembered the small cuts on her fingers, the way she winced but pressed on, unwilling to let exhaustion win. Her eyes had carried both weariness and defiance, as though she could stare poverty itself into retreat if only she held on long enough. He remembered his father collapsing into a chair after punishing shifts, the smell of iron and sweat clinging to him, his frame slumped as though every bone carried the weight of the world. He remembered how his father's silence spoke louder than words, how each sigh carried the grief of a man who knew he was being broken piece by piece but still rose each morning for the sake of those he loved. Those memories, long buried beneath the sheen of wealth and the cold polish of success, rose unbidden to the surface, battering against him with a force he could not resist. He had thought himself untouchable, insulated by the empire he had built, but in that storm-drenched moment he realized how fragile the distance truly was. And in that raw clarity, Alexander understood with a painful sharpness that the frail couple before him could have been his parents, people who had once fought, once sacrificed, and might have been crushed entirely had fate turned against them just a little more. The thought hollowed him out, stripping away the illusions of separation, erasing the comforting lie that he was somehow different, somehow exempt. What remained was a truth he could no longer deny: the line between survival and ruin was thinner than he had ever allowed himself to admit. And now, standing beneath the fury of the storm, Alexander felt it crack through him, the first fracture in the armor he had mistaken for strength, the first stirrings of a compassion he had nearly lost. The rain poured harder, soaking through his expensive suit until it clung uncomfortably to his skin, but Alexander no longer cared. The cold, the discomfort, the storm's unrelenting force, all of it dissolved into insignificance as the sight of the frail couple held him rooted in their orbit. At last, with a breath that felt heavier than any deal he had ever made, he forced himself forward. His polished shoes sank into the mud, forgotten, as he crouched beside the pair. His voice, usually steady and commanding, trembled as he called out to them, uncertain if they could even hear him above the storm. The elderly man stirred weakly, his lids fluttering before lifting to reveal eyes clouded with fatigue and confusion. There was a fragility in his movements, as though every ounce of strength left in his body had to be bargained for. The woman beside him, her face pale and etched with years of endurance, clung to her husband's hand with a desperate, unyielding grip. Though her body shook from the cold and her lips were tinged with blue, there was something immovable in her touch, a quiet declaration that she would not let go, no matter what forces sought to separate them. Her strength was fragile, yet her will was unbroken. Alexander's chest tightened. Their bodies trembled from both hunger and cold, and it was painfully clear they had traveled far beyond what their age and frailty could endure. Something primal surged within him, urgency cutting through the haze of disbelief. His heart pounded as he turned sharply to his staff, his voice breaking through the roar of rain. It was commanding, yet cracked with emotion, carrying not only authority but desperation. Blankets. Hot drinks. Help, now. The urgency in his tone left no room for hesitation. In that instant, the grandeur of his estate no longer mattered. The gleaming driveway that had once stood as a symbol of status and pride had been stripped of its meaning. It was no longer a stage for displays of power or wealth. Tonight, it became something else entirely, a place of rescue, a ground upon which an unspoken vow was born. With a care he had not shown in years, Alexander slid his arms beneath their fragile frames. Their bones felt impossibly light beneath his touch, their bodies weakened by hunger and weariness, yet the weight of what they carried pressed on him more heavily than stone. He lifted, steadying them against himself, his strong arms becoming a shield as he rose with them. Slowly, step by step, he guided them toward the mansion, his movements deliberate, reverent. Each step across the soaked gravel, each staggered movement closer to shelter, felt like a declaration etched into his very being: his wealth, his empire, his achievements meant nothing, absolutely nothing, if they could not be bent toward lifting others who had fallen. Inside, the storm was left behind. The roar of the rain gave way to silence broken only by the hushed urgency of voices and the crackle of a fire lit quickly to drive out the chill. Warmth spilled through the high-ceilinged halls, golden light softening the hard edges of marble and stone. Staff moved swiftly, their hands wrapping blankets around frail shoulders, pressing steaming cups into shivering hands. Slowly, under that care and under the heat that seeped through layers of soaked fabric, the couple began to stir back to life. The violent shivering eased into softer tremors. Their breaths, once sharp and uneven, steadied. And then, at last, their voices emerged. Faint, halting at first, broken by fatigue and thirst, but real and alive. The woman's name was Martha. The man's was Henry. Their story came in fragments, torn pieces of a life unraveling. Each word cutting deeper into Alexander's chest than the last. They had once owned a modest home, small but steady, a place where love had built its walls far sturdier than brick. But the burden of overdue payments had crushed that foundation. Slowly, relentlessly, it had been taken from them, piece by piece, until the day they were forced to leave. Their children, grown, distant, and long gone, had not returned to help. They had once filled that home with laughter and chaos, but now those echoes had faded into silence, leaving Martha and Henry to face the erosion of security on their own. With nowhere left to turn, they had packed what remained of their lives into a single battered suitcase. But the suitcase held no treasures, no valuables to trade or sell. Instead, it carried something far heavier, memories. Photographs of youth, faded yet glowing with joy. Letters yellowed with age, ink blurred by years but words still etched with love. Mementos of birthdays, of milestones, of a family that had once been close enough to hold but now lived only in fragments of paper and fading snapshots. As Alexander listened, the weight of their story pressed down upon him, more suffocating than the storm itself. The empire he had built suddenly felt small against the simple truth of what they had lost, and the fragile, stubborn strength it had taken them to carry their lives in that suitcase and make it this far. As Martha's voice trembled through the tale, her words halting as though each memory was both too heavy and too precious to release, Henry nodded faintly beside her. His silence did not come from indifference, but from exhaustion, the kind of deep weariness that seeps into bones and soul alike. Yet even in his silence, his presence affirmed her story. Together, their account painted a picture that pierced deeper than Alexander was prepared to endure. He felt his chest tighten, the weight of their suffering pressing against his ribs like a vice. Every word another turn of pressure that left him struggling to breathe. They had been walking for hours, perhaps days, wandering without direction, driven only by the primal need for shelter. Each step they had taken had been a battle against time and against bodies too frail to withstand such punishment. Their journey had no clear destination, no certainty, only the desperate hope that somewhere, anywhere, they might find reprieve. And when at last their strength gave way, when their bodies finally surrendered to exhaustion, it was here, before his gates, before the cream-colored walls and glowing windows of his mansion, that they had fallen. The thought hollowed him out. The image of them collapsing not on some forgotten roadside, but at the very threshold of his empire, was not coincidence, it was confrontation. A truth he could not ignore. Listening to them, Alexander felt the walls he had built within himself begin to crack. He could no longer retreat into the easy comfort of detachment, no longer hide behind the shield of wealth that had allowed him to remain untouched by suffering. Their story pierced through every barrier, cutting to the heart of who he was, and reminding him not only of the hardships he had buried in his past, but of the responsibility he had long abandoned. And in their faces, in their trembling hands, he saw a mirror. A warning of what neglect, pride, and ambition could reduce even the strongest bonds to. His thoughts, unbidden and relentless, turned to his estranged brother, the man with whom he had once shared childhood dreams and whispered hopes beneath the same roof. That bond, too, had been weathered and then broken, shattered by their bitter dispute over their parents' inheritance. For years he had told himself the rift was justified, necessary even, a matter of principle. But in truth, it had been pride, a hard, unyielding pride that had grown unchecked within him until it eclipsed every chance of reconciliation. Now, sitting across from Henry and Martha, watching them cling to one another in fragile defiance of the life that had stripped them of everything else, Alexander felt the sting of regret sharper than he had ever known. He thought of the countless moments he had traded away, family gatherings missed for the sake of lucrative meetings, phone calls unanswered in pursuit of deals, opportunities for connection cast aside for the hollow glow of ambition. It was all there, laid bare before him, the choices that had brought him wealth, yes, but had also carved away pieces of the man he might have been. Henry and Martha's story was more than tragedy. It was a warning, a glimpse of what could happen when the bonds of love and care are neglected, when ambition devours the very ties that give life its meaning. In the days that followed, Alexander made certain the couple wanted for nothing. Doctors were summoned to examine them, to ease the tremors that racked their bodies and treat the lingering toll of hunger and cold. Fresh clothing replaced the soaked, clinging rags that had once weighed them down, garments too fine for their station but offered without hesitation. Warm meals, rich with nourishment, were placed before them, each bite restoring energy, each dish replacing despair with life. And slowly, with care and patience, the weight that had once bent them low began to lift. Hunger loosened its cruel grip. Exhaustion released them. And with each passing day, the dim spark of dignity, so nearly extinguished, began to glow once more. Martha's smiles came more often, fragile at first but slowly gathering strength, her tired eyes shimmering with gratitude. Sometimes she laughed, the sound faint and fleeting, yet unmistakably alive, an echo of the youth she had once known, resurfacing against all odds. Henry, though still frail, found his voice again. His words, once strained and halting, grew steadier as he recounted fragments of the past, the days when he had worked with strong hands. When his body had been a vessel of strength rather than frailty, when providing for his family had been both duty and pride. Though his voice cracked with age, there was steel in the memories he spoke aloud, and Alexander listened to them as though they were sacred truths. Through their resilience, Alexander witnessed something he had almost forgotten, something no empire, no fortune, no wealth could ever truly replace. In every smile, in every fragile word, in every act of defiance against despair, he saw the quiet, unbreakable strength of human connection. And as he bore witness, something inside him shifted, peeling away the hardened layers that had long encased his heart, leaving behind something softer, something raw, and something undeniably real. It wasn't only Henry and Martha who were being transformed. Each time Alexander visited them, each time he sat at their bedside and listened to their stories, he felt the hardened layers of his own heart peeling away. The shield he had constructed over decades of ruthless striving, brick by brick, deal by deal, began to crack. And through those fractures seeped a warmth he had long forgotten, a gentleness that had once lived within him before ambition demanded its silence. He found himself lingering less in the vast chambers of his office, surrounded by towering shelves of contracts and records, and more in the modest guest rooms where the couple rested. Those rooms, once seldom used, now seemed alive, filled with the quiet cadence of Martha's soft laughter or the low rumble of Henry's recollections. Alexander absorbed their words not as idle stories, but as lessons, each memory a thread of wisdom, each reflection a mirror of resilience. Their lives, etched by hardship, reminded him of truths he had buried beneath his relentless climb to success, that compassion outweighed conquest, that the quiet dignity of kindness outshone the loud triumphs of wealth, and that human connection was worth more than any empire could ever give. In their presence, Alexander rediscovered something he hadn't even realized was missing, the quiet, enduring value of care, of love, of simply being there for another soul when the world had abandoned them. The day finally arrived when Henry and Martha were strong enough to leave the mansion. Their steps were still careful, their movements still slow, but their eyes carried life again, a spark restored by rest, nourishment, and the comfort of being seen. Yet Alexander had no intention of letting them return to the uncertainty of the world that had already taken so much from them. Quietly, without seeking recognition or thanks, he had prepared a home for them, a modest little cottage nestled among the trees not far from his own estate. It was not grand, nor adorned with the trappings of luxury, but it radiated safety, warmth, and belonging. It was theirs, a place they could claim not as a temporary shelter but as a permanent home. When he placed the keys into Martha's trembling hands, she clutched them as if they were the most precious jewels in the world. Her whispered, "Thank you," broke the air with raw emotion, her voice cracking as tears streamed freely down her weathered face. Henry did not speak much in that moment, for words would have failed him. Instead, he placed a hand upon Alexander's shoulder, his grip surprisingly firm for a man so frail, his eyes brimming with gratitude and unspoken recognition. It was a gesture that carried more weight than any speech, a quiet acknowledgement that bound them together beyond circumstance, beyond charity. As Alexander turned back toward his mansion, the storm that had once drenched the earth was gone. In its place, golden sunlight spilled gently across the estate, casting long, warm beams upon the wet grass. The rain had not merely washed the lawns, it had cleansed something deeper, something within him. The emptiness that had haunted even his greatest successes seemed to dissolve, replaced by a quiet, steady peace that settled in his chest. And in that moment, as he walked beneath the oak tree where he had first found them, Alexander understood. Wealth could build walls, but it could never fill the hollow spaces of the soul. Fortune could buy comfort, but it could not grant meaning. For the first time in years, Alexander felt whole, not because of what he possessed, but because of what he had chosen to give. Compassion had done what riches never could, it had given him back himself.